Okay, welcome everybody to the second webinar that the ETUI is organizing. My name is Maria Nikolova. I'm a communication officer at the ETUI, and today I'll be your host at this first edition of a new ETUI series of webinars on the new normal in the world of work after the COVID crisis. This unprecedented crisis has created new challenges for millions of people and has accentuated inequalities among workers that have been there before. In this series of webinars, we would like to look, together with our guests, at what needs to be done in the long run so that the world of work gets better equipped to deal with such distortions, which are very likely to happen again. Today, we will look more closely at the idea of the universal basic income, which for many years now has been promoted as a way to limit the rise of poverty and precarity in a worsening economic context, and which has been very present in the debates in the current crisis. We will then hear more about the difference between minimum wages and living wages and the potential of this wage policy to enable workers and their families to enjoy a decent standard of living in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. And finally, we'll hear about the position of the European trade unions on these topics and the recent developments at European level. Before I present you the speakers today, I would like to launch a very simple anonymous poll to get an idea of your attitude towards an unconditional basic income and the level of implementation of a living wage. Please answer the two simple questions that you should see now on your screen. I hope this will work. Okay. The answers start coming. While you vote in the poll, I will go on and present our panelists who will now turn off their cameras so that you will be able to see them. We'll have the pleasure today to welcome Anke Hassel, who is Professor of Public Policy at the Hertie School in Berlin. From 2016 to 2019, she was the Scientific Director of the Institute of Economic and Social Research at the Hans Buchler Foundation. Then we have our ETUI colleague, Thorsten Müller, who is a senior researcher in the field of collective bargaining. And last but not least, we are very glad that Esther Lynch could join our discussion. Esther is Deputy General Secretary of the ETUC, responsible, among others, for social dialogue, collective bargaining, and wage policy. I have already received some questions from you from the registration form, which I'm going to use for the discussion afterwards. You'll also be able to submit questions to the speakers via the Q&A option on the bottom of your screens. And you can do this during the presentations and also afterwards during the discussion. I cannot promise that we can take all the questions. There are a lot of people attending, but we will do our best to reply to most questions. Before we let Anke tell us what the universal basic income is, what is argued that it can achieve, and what is her opinion of it, let me show you what the audience thinks of the idea. So I will end the polling now. We have 95 people of 120 attending have voted. So I'll end it and I'll share the results with you. So what do we see? Well, most of our attendees are in favor of the universal basic income. So let's see what Anke has to tell us about it and whether their opinion will change after this. So I'll give the floor to Anke. Yeah, you can. Yeah, Anke, you can, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Maria, for having me and, letting me speak about the universal basic income, which I find a very interesting debate, in particular now during the COVID crisis. And what I would like to do in the next 10 minutes or so is basically explain and introduce the UBI and say, what do we actually know about it? And then at the very end, I will say some things on whether or not the corona crisis now changes the discussion on the UBI, and I think it might actually change it. So what is it? The criteria for the UBI is A, that it is universal, but it is not so easy to define what universal actually means, because we get different answers in different debates. We usually think that universal might mean it should be for all citizens, but if we would look more closely, for instance, at the debate that was part of the Swiss referendum, it was not clear, for instance, whether migrants or foreigners living in Switzerland would be entitled for the UBI. So universality needs to be clarified when we talk about the UBI. What we have a consensus on is that the UBI should be an individual right. It is not a government handout, but it is a right that the citizen can claim. And most importantly, there's no means testing involved. So it does not matter what the individual earns or what the asset of an individual are. Everyone would get the same amount of money, no matter how wealthy a person is. There are no obligations attached to a UBI. Everyone would get it. There is no expectation that you participate in any kind of activation schemes, in active labor market policies, in training schemes, etc. And it should be a living income. So a UBI should not be a small handout, but it should be an income on which you can live. And in most discussions, we talk about roughly 1,000 euros per month, and in some cases even higher. There is a debate about how much we would pay for children. It is clear that the amount for children would be lower, but how low, it is not certain. So this is roughly what we understand by a universal basic income. We have a political discourse which has been going on for a longer period of time, and in particular during the last 5 to 10 years, there was a renewed political interest in the UBI. There was a referendum in Switzerland in 2016. In the referendum, it got support by about 23% of those who voted in the referendum. The amount that the people who initiated the referendum were talking about were about 25,000 euros a year. So this is considerably higher than what is discussed in most other schemes. And it is 50% of the median income. And that is how they came up with the 25,000. And what you can see on the right is roughly the idea about the financing of the UBI in the Swiss proposal, because the UBI, as you can imagine, is very expensive. But what people in Switzerland argued is that the government actually does not have to put up all the money. And if you look at the yellow bar is really the amount you need in order to finance it. But then the share, the pink share of about 55 billion euros is what the government is paying out in social spending anyway. And the green bar is actually what they call wages. And in the Swiss proposal, the idea was that part of that is currently paid as wages would then become the UBI. And finally, the blue bar, the smallest one, the 25 billion euros, is the proportion of which family members support each other at the moment. And the assumption is if you have a UBI, family members do not have to support each other and you can use this money in a different way. So that was the financing idea of the Swiss referendum. We have experiments since then in a number of countries. And one famous experiment is the experiment in Finland. And in Finland, it was a trial experiment with about 2,000 unemployed people, and they received 560 euros per month, and that was 25% of median pay. And the way it was set up was that these people were unemployed. If they had additional earnings through the labor market, these additional earnings would not lead to a lower benefit. But if they claimed additional benefits, these would be taken into account. The Finnish experiment ran from 2017 to 2018. We now have the results, and I come back to the results in a moment. But the results in all of the experiments of UBIs that have been carried on over the last years or so is basically always the same. What we find is that recipients of a UBI say they have better health, they're in general happier with their lives, they have better education, but they also participate in the labor markets less. And that is a finding which we find in almost all cases where we have applications of the UBI. And that is the same with the Finnish experiment. The Finnish experiments had other problems because social assistance regulations were changed throughout the experiment, and it also lost in political support over the period of time. So we are not quite sure what to do with the results of the Finnish experiment. There are other experiments. Another one is Ontario. Ontario and Canada also introduced a basic income pilot study in 2017. It was cancelled after 17 months when a new government came in, which didn't support it anymore. And there are also more localized local experiments in Utrecht in the Netherlands, but also in Barcelona. And these experiments all have the same goal because they want to study new instruments for combating poverty. Most of these experiments are really directed towards poverty prevention, but also social exclusion, employment, housing, education, health, and happiness. And there are a number of assumptions you make that if you give people a lump sum of money, you get a positive effect on all these problems. Here, I just can show you some results of the Barcelona experiment. So they did an evaluation study after 1 year, and this is from a report which was published last year. And what you can see is the comparison between the treatment group and the control group. And they had a lot, this was a complex experiment. They had many different groups, but if you just look at the first bar, which is the treatment group, you can see that the probability of developing a mental illness was lower in the treatment group, so lower in the group that got the UBI, but also the probability of working was lower in the treatment group. And as I said, this is a standard feature of all UBI experiments that you get. People are happier, healthier, but also people work less where UBI is introduced. So do we have UBIs? I think the only real UBIs which you can find in the world, which is not an experiment or a pilot study, is actually the Alaska Permanent Fund. And these are funds which come out of oil revenues from the state, from state-owned oil. And it is basically a dividend which is paid to all inhabitants of Alaska. And the dividend is between $1,000 and $2,000 per person annually, which is actually quite a low sum of money because the average income in Alaska is about $40,000. So it is really not relevant for the income of people, but that is actually the only scheme where we can say this is a universal income which is paid to all people and with no strings attached. So what do we know historically? There are a number of other historical experiments which have been carried out. Another one in Canada, and this is the Mincome study, and that was in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, we had a number of experiments, in particular in Canada, but also in the US. So in this study, we had 1,000 families who got 100 Canadian dollars per month, which was near the poverty rate, but there was also a withdrawal rate. So for each additional income that was earned by these families, 50% were withdrawn from the basic income. What were the effects? There were also studies done afterwards. How did people's behavior change because of the UBI? Again, the result is similar to the ones we have already seen. There's a reduction in the employment rate. The employment rate went down by about 11%, but also healthcare costs went down because hospitals were less busy during that time. People went to the doctor less. People were less ill during that time, and education rates went up. So that you had fewer high school dropouts, and you have a higher school attainment rate for these people who were on the basic income. Again, people are healthier, happier, better educated, but people work less if they do that. And the final experiment which we know about is an experiment also in the 1970s, which was done also in the US. And this was based on the negative income tax that was heavily discussed at the time. And there was a time, when there was an expectation that the negative income tax would actually be introduced as a major social policy scheme in the US. And there were these different experiments, always over a period between 4 and 8 years. And again, we have positive effects of poverty. When we have a UBI, again, we have effects on education, but we also have effects on nutrition. They checked what did people eat. Were people healthier? They looked at weight at birth. When children were born into poor families, they figured out that they had higher weight at birth, so they were healthier when they were born in poor families. There was also an effect on family life. We had fewer divorces in these cases, but we also had less domestic violence. So these are positive effects for poverty. Again, the negative effect is a reduction in working hours, and the negative effect is obviously it is very costly. And this is just a slide where you can see it from an evaluation study on the UBI, and that was the UBI in New Jersey, Pennsylvania. And what you see in the first two columns is the reduction in working hours, and you can see it for men and women, for husbands and wives, but you see it in all categories that working hours declined, and you had quite a high percentage difference when you look at the white male workers. So to sum up, what we have at the moment is only one UBI, and that is the Alaska Permanent Fund. That is the only existing model we have, but it is not really relevant in terms of the level of the payment. We have experiments with the UBI, which were in the past targeted at poverty. We have modern experiments in Finland, Canada, and Spain, which also target poverty, but they also always had an aim to look at the administration, because the assumption was that currently social assistance administration is very complex. You could reduce it by just giving a flat handout to poor people. We have a political debate, and the political debate is often very detached from what we know from these experiments. I have a final comment, and this is really about how does it change at the moment, and what is the role of UBI at the moment in the COVID-19 crisis. What we have seen over the last 2 months is a response in most European countries, which was very similar, and which has focused very heavily on short-term working schemes, or so-called furlough schemes. And furlough schemes are subsidies to wages for workers who cannot work because their companies are either shut down or their businesses do not operate at the moment. And companies are given an incentive to hang on to these workers, to not make them redundant by paying them a subsidy through the government. So furlough schemes at the moment are very successful and are heavily used. And we know in Germany, for instance, there's an estimate that we have currently about 10 million people on furlough. We know that from the UK that about a quarter of working people are on furlough schemes at the moment. The question is what happens in the midterm future. So if the pandemic continues and if people cannot go back to work, they also cannot go out and find new work, because the economy will permanently, or at least for a rather long period of time, be affected by the pandemic. And in that case, you will not be able to ask companies to hang on to these workers indefinitely. So there is a time limit attached to the furlough schemes. And in most countries, unlike Germany, or even in Germany, there's a time limit attached to furlough schemes, which is initially 12 months, but it can be extended to 24 months. But in most other European countries, the time limit to furlough schemes is much lower, and it is usually 3 months. The UK has now extended it until the end of October, but it is clear that the government does not want to pay these wage subsidies permanently. And if the pandemic continues, the question is what will happen to these workers if these jobs will disappear because the government will not pay the wage subsidy anymore. And at that time, we will have a new discussion about UBI, because we cannot go back to the old and traditional unemployment insurance schemes and unemployment assistance schemes, because all of them have the element of activation attached to it. And I think as soon as activation will lose its meaning in labor market policies, we will come back to a discussion of a scheme that will give economic security to everyone, every worker, but also those who will have lost their jobs without any strings attached. And as soon as you start discussing that, you are in a discussion about the UBI. The problem is, and that is, a discussion which is very often had in trade union circles, but not only in trade union circles, is that the UBI will be at a poverty level. You will not get a status maintenance income benefits which are higher than just poverty preventive measures. So they're not meant for the middle classes. And even though it is at a poverty level, the financial volume of UBIs is at a level which is prohibitive. And if you look at the experiments about which I talked a moment ago, we see that most of them were stopped because they were very expensive. At least in the 1970s, there was always the effect that, that governments decided that it is too expensive to spend so much money on UBI. So I think we will get a discussion on UBI if the pandemic continues, and the discussion will be very difficult. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Anke, for this. Maybe we go, I think we take the questions afterwards, and we go now directly to Thorsten. Thorsten, can you please talk us through the difference between minimum wage and living wages and give some examples maybe for living wage approaches in different countries?
Okay.
I think it was the wrong screen that you wanted to share with us.
Really, was it?
Yeah, you should open the PowerPoint.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's okay.
Here we go. Okay.
Yes.
Is that okay now? Well, I should. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, first of all, hello to everybody. And yeah, I will talk about the difference between minimum and living wages and about the spread of living wages across Europe. Now, I think first of all, it's important to draw a distinction between minimum and living wages, because historically, actually, the two meant the same thing. At the beginning of the 20th century, we found many texts that spoke of a minimum living wage. And it is just the last 20 or 30 years or so that the meaning of the two diverged increasingly, and the minimum wage became basically understood as a basic wage floor, and the living wage assumed the meaning of going beyond subsistence and actually enabling the workers a decent living standard, and in particular also participation in society, which is a very important element. And this distinction is very important because if we look at the emergence of the first modern living wage movements in the US and in the United Kingdom, it was exactly the insufficiency of minimum wages in addressing the increasing problem of in-work poverty and of wage inequality that calls for a living wage became more prominent. I mean, in the US, we saw the first living wage ordinances at local level in the first half of the 90s. And then it turned into a national movement with the Fight for 15 movement in the US. And in the UK, we had the same tendency. It started as local initiatives with the London living wage. And then in 2011, it became a national movement with the establishment of the Living Wage Foundation. Living wage movements as such are mainly limited to English-speaking countries. We have similar tendencies in Ireland, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But I think when we look at the US and the UK, we also see a difference already in how we determine the living wage. Because in the US, it was an agreement among the people and the activists that they want approximately double the amount of the federal minimum wage, which was $15, and it was easy to communicate, fight for 15. In the UK, there was a little bit, there was a difference, because in the UK from the very beginning, it was very important that there is a calculation attached to the living wage to give it, that was the rationale in the UK, more credibility. And that is a point I will come to now. How do we calculate and how do we determine a living wage? I mean, there are essentially two different approaches. The first one is the basic living cost approach. And there we actually have or determine a certain basket of goods and services which are needed to have a decent living. And I think in the case of the living wage, it's important that this is not just about housing, food and clothes, but that it is also about recreation, education, communication, and all these things that actually enable participation in society. And the second approach is basically the wage distribution approach. And there you look at the at risk of poverty wage threshold, which is usually 60% of the median. And then you take that as your living wage. In most of the English-speaking countries, the basket approach has been chosen. In London, the London living wage is quite interesting because at the beginning that was, but they used both methods. They established a figure for the living wage according to the 60% of the median, but they also used the basket, and then they combined the two. They basically built the average out of those two figures then. Now they have an adjusted method for the whole of the UK, and that's based on a basket and a reference budget. Now, if we look at the 60% of the median, we can see that in Europe, and these are the countries where you have a statutory minimum wage, the minimum wage is below and considerably below the 60% of the median, which we define as the at risk of poverty wage threshold in most of the countries. Basically, it's only Portugal and France where we reach the 60%, but Portugal is an interesting case because even though statistically we have the 60% of the median, every person living in Portugal will tell you that the minimum wage is actually not enough to make a living. And that's why I think it is important, even if you choose the fairly pragmatic approach of the 60% of the median, that you kind of have a reality check to see if these 60% of the median actually are enough to make a living, and that reality check could then be based on the basket approach. Now, the insufficiency of minimum wages in addressing these problems and the low level, as I have just shown in most of the European countries, led to several national initiatives which are now spread far beyond the English-speaking world. In the continental Europe, it's not called living wage because, well, yeah, it's an English term, but there's also, it's difficult to translate. In German, for instance, we don't have an appropriate translation, and I think that applies to many other countries. But the objective that has been pursued in the various countries is the same. They want to raise minimum wages to a level that workers can make a living from what they earn. And these national initiatives are mainly driven by trade unions, but they find broad support with NGOs and other actors of civil society. And in that respect, there is a broader movement in continental Europe now as well to substantially increase minimum wages to a living wage level. And these are differently ambitious. I mean, the most ambitious union strategies we find in Belgium and the Netherlands, where they ask for an increase of 35%. Basically, they want 14 euros per hour as a new minimum wage, and that would mean, compared to the current level, 35% increase. In other countries like Austria, Czechia, France, Germany, Ireland, Luxembourg, Portugal, and the UK, the demands are less ambitious, but still between 10 and 35%. Now, I don't want to go into detail, but Austria, I want to highlight, because in Austria, you don't actually have a statutory minimum wage, but still the Austrian Trade Union Federation, the ÖGB, says that no collective agreement should be concluded below 1,700 euros per month. And that shows that you can have such a floor also in a system where you don't have a statutory minimum wage, but where minimum wages are essentially negotiated, or basically the lowest wage group in your collective agreement. I think Austria is a very good example in that respect. I still want to highlight 3 exceptions where in 2 cases, in Slovakia and Spain, the initiative is supported by unions, but the initiative was actually taken by the government. In Slovakia, we have a law that, or a new regulation, that the minimum wage should be 60% of the national average wage even. If trade unions and employers cannot agree on a minimum wage, and in Spain, the government announced that by 2024, the minimum wage should also be 60% of the national average wage. And then Slovenia, the third special case, is very interesting because there we actually had already a successful living wage campaign in the sense of increasing the minimum wage to 60% of the national median. And that was in 2010, where the Slovenian trade unions achieved an increase of the minimum wage to by 23%. And by the way, without significant negative consequences for competitiveness and employment in the country, which is very important. And that success is actually the first successful living wage movement in continental Europe, I would say. And since then, since this increase in 2010, they managed to keep the level at 60% of the national median. In the graph I've shown you just now, Slovenia is at 59%. So that is one successful example that this is possible. Now, what do living wages and Corona, what's the link? Because very often we hear now voices who say, well, in current economic circumstances, it's impossible to have a living wage. We cannot afford it. Some even call for a postponement of the initiative at European level. But my argument would be exactly the opposite, especially in a situation of a crisis. We need a living wage for three reasons. Mainly, first of all, the crisis revealed the importance of what are now currently called essential workers and how badly they are paid. And I think a living wage would be one way, and not to just applaud them, but also pay them properly. And actually, revalue these kind of jobs. And it's an upgrading. I think a living wage would be appropriate here. Secondly, a living wage can act as an economic stabilizer by boosting internal demand. And I think there, one lesson from the crisis in 2008, 2009 is that purely supply side oriented approaches to get out of the crisis based on austerity and internal devaluation lead to catastrophic social consequences. So in that respect, I think one lesson learned could be a living wage as part of a demand-led way out of the crisis. And secondly, if you look beyond the economic dimension, I think a living wage is an important anchor for political and social stability. Because when we see that more and more people feel let down by their governments and feel left behind economically in terms of wages, that the state doesn't do enough for them, that feeds a trend towards supporting more extremist and in particular right-wing parties. And I think in that respect, the living wage could also be part of the package of creating more political and social stability. Yeah, I didn't talk about the European level. I leave that to Esther, and I want to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torsten. Yeah, thank you, Torsten. Yeah, Esther, as Torsten said, you'll talk about the European level. With regard, you're going to tell us what is happening there with regard to wages and what is the ETUC stance on that. Some of us might remember that Ursula von der Leyen, when presenting her agenda for Europe, announced a European initiative on minimum wages. Maybe you can tell us more about that. And to look maybe back to the, again, to the poll, I will share the results. I don't know if you see it now, but well, we asked the question, what is the most appropriate level to initiate a living wage policy? And there it is quite balanced, the answer, but most people, about 60%, think that the European Union level is the right level. So just go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Hello to everybody. I think that what the two presentations show us is that there is a lot of thinking about how do we address the crisis of insecurity and poverty that is absolutely was big before the COVID crisis, but is even bigger now. So many people report that they were struggling to make ends meet, even though they had a job before the crisis, but now struggling even more that they have been had their hours cut back or are not being paid because of the measures that have been adopted. The European Foundation for the Improvement on Living and Working Conditions reporting a massive survey from around Europe that the consequence of the bad terms and conditions and low pay before the crisis, what that meant, that people had no savings and literally living week to week beforehand, and now finding themselves in critical and severe conditions because they don't have work. And I think that the first proposal for the universal basic income has a lot of very interesting ideas associated with it. I think the reason people are very interested in it is because it sets a floor of certainty below which nobody's going to fall. And I think that's really important for everybody, whether they have a job or don't have a job. People are fearful about the future. They're fearful about the consequences of what's going to happen next. And they want to know that if they did lose their job, that wouldn't mean financial destitution for the family, including homelessness, and like the people are really, really fearful about what is the safety net, like where is the bottom rung of the ladder in Europe now. And I think that's the interesting thing about all of the discussions on minimum income guarantees. They don't all need to be universal, but there does need to be a minimum income guarantee in Europe. And I think that's one of the interesting ideas. We're putting a lot of thought into it. My colleague Lena Carr is leading a discussion which relates to a directive on minimum income. So at European level, we would say that there must be a threshold of decency below which no individual, no family should be fearful that they will fall. I think also part of the attraction in the universal basic income idea is, I know from when I was unemployed, and I know from talking to my friends who are currently unemployed, that it's very difficult to actually get unemployment payments even though you're unemployed. And there's a lot of stigma attached to it. There shouldn't be, but people feel that there is. And often they feel that there is because they're made to feel that way by the way in which the systems require you to jump through so many hoops before you can secure a payment. That should be your right. It should be an entitlement. It shouldn't be something to which you're made to feel bad about yourself because you've come to claim your just entitlement. And I think that's more significant than policymakers actually realize. That there is, like, I know when I was unemployed that it's difficult to keep your confidence up over the long term, particularly when you are faced with so many institutional difficulties and so many messages coming about you. So I think that is also has to be part of our consideration as the union movement, which is how are we properly challenging and making it very clear that people are entitled to a payment. It's a right. And this is what I get a little bit worried about the universal basic income idea, in how it will operate, in how society thinks about who has an obligation to who. And it seems to me employers are getting entirely away free in this discussion. And what I mean by that is, it used to be the case that if you became unemployed, you got your entitlement from a fund to which you had paid in some and the employer had paid in another. And then it was seen as an insurance that you had paid into and that you got it back as a clear entitlement. And society saw it that way, and employers were made to live up to their responsibilities in that regard. And I worry that a lot of the largest advocates for universal basic income are the online platforms, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the who seem to think that it's the state's responsibility and not theirs. That, you know, that there's no responsibility on employers to retrain people who lose, you know, whose careers are about to be replaced by robotics or artificial intelligence. That the employers don't have to pay a living wage because the poverty will be picked up through the universal basic income. And I think that is not a vision of the future that trade unions subscribe to. So I often hear that people say, well, unions are just against universal basic income. That's to misunderstand. The unions are against a future in which employers take all the benefits of everything and then have no responsibilities and push it all onto the state. That's one of our big fears. And looking at that, we're also afraid of we will have whole communities who there's a vision for, which is universal basic income, and then there'll be another communities that there's a vision for, which is good jobs, and that, you know, and that's not the new normal we should be aiming for. So to say that but I think we need an honest, not ideological discussion, but we need an honest, frank discussion about how do we make sure that there is a bottom rung on the ladder, it's a threshold of decency, and that you get it as an entitlement and a right, and so that begin to remove some of the fear. And I thought Anka's presentation was really interesting because what it demonstrated that there were some jobs that are so bad, that they're just so bad that people are relieved not to be able to have to do them anymore. And we need to face up to that as well and acknowledge that and tackle that too. Then when it comes to the living wage discussion and the minimum wage discussion, it's really important that we don't focus only on the state's role in setting minimum wages. So the state has in a lot of member states in Europe a really important role in establishing a baseline wage below which employers would go if they could, but the law has to step in and stop them from doing that. But that's not our vision of a fair wage. Our vision of a fair wage is one which is collectively bargained. And if you look at the difference between Denmark and Bulgaria, the critical difference in the average wages is that you have union bargaining in Denmark for the majority of workers, and you do not have union bargaining in Bulgaria, for example, for the majority of workers. And then in between that, you have all, you know, different levels. And there's a real role for the European Union to step in and to say to member states, you have to make sure that workers can join a union without fear, and that employers have to bargain with their workforce if that's what their workforce wants to do. And that in that way, we begin to get a fairer share of the profits, because a fair wage isn't just one that you have a poverty line. A fair wage is one where you get a fair share because you've turned up at work, you've given your commitment, the company has benefited from that, so there must be a fair share coming back to you. And the big difference in the last 10, 15 years is the share of profits that was going to the workforce has decreased. And you can track a graph which says, here's the drop in the number of workers covered by a collective agreement, with how much of the share of the profits are going to the workforce. And I think that has to be part of the European solution, which has to be about putting a lot more power into the hands of workers. So my final 3 points are this. We have 3 opportunities to create change. One is the proposal by Nicholas Schmidt and Ursula von der Leyen to have directives setting out fair minimum wages in Europe that give a decent standard of living. that is an opportunity to make sure that everybody can belong to a union, can bargain for a fair wage, and to set a floor below which people won't go. The second opportunity we have is the Pay Transparency Directive, and we can use the Pay Transparency Directive to address all those sectors, predominantly where women work and where the pay is just, their work is undervalued and they're underpaid. And we can use the Pay Transparency Directive to challenge that, and frankly, to pay back to everybody who has been on the front line, continuing to work through this crisis. And it would be so unacceptable if what happened at the end of this was that they had their pay frozen or cut. Really what we have to do is to challenge the idea that low paid workers, that there's any legitimate reason to pay workers in those sectors so low. And then the third opportunity is that there is a proposal for an initiative, a directive relating to minimum income, and that should set a guarantee to take fear away, so that people can be confident that if they were to lose their job, or indeed were to become sick, that they wouldn't face complete financial ruin as a consequence of that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Esther. Now you have basically answered a lot of the questions that have been put forward, but maybe something that we haven't mentioned, that you haven't mentioned, there are people saying or asking, how do you see the relationship of the universal basic income with public services? Should we not consider implementing a program of universal basic services instead of the universal basic income? I think we can talk more about this, the services, and I have a question to Anke, because I've read something that she has written recently in a German newspaper. You have proposed that the German government should give every German citizen 500 euros as a coronavirus supplement. How is this different to a basic income? Can you maybe explain what your proposal was exactly? I think it would be interesting for people to hear. And then, people worrying about the concept of living wage because it doesn't work for unemployed, for people who don't have a job. Maybe we can answer those concerns. I don't know if you want, you can do it one after the other, or just whoever wants to respond.
I can say something very quickly on the coronavirus 500 euro supplement. So when we wrote this, it was at the very beginning of the crisis, and it was when it was clear that a lot of people, in particular self-employed people, would lose their income overnight. So directed to artists or interpreters, or people who did not have any employment, but also no claim on unemployment insurance money or any kind of short-term working scheme. So that is and that was before the German government had made any rescue package and any bailout package. And so we made this proposal as a sort of initial response by the government to hand out money to people who need it immediately. What happened then afterwards, the week afterwards, was really that the government designed a rescue package which went far beyond that. We were discussing 500 euros. What they did was they made 5,000 euros available for every self-employed who needed it. And this was implemented in a very fast and unbureaucratic way. So we were just sort of a bit too early with what we were thinking about. And that really doesn't have any bearings on a wider scheme or long-term scheme. I want to say two things, if I may. One is about the universal basic service. So if I had to choose between a universal basic income and universal basic services, I would always choose the service over the income, because the big danger is that if we get too much involved in a discussion about a universal basic income, and if we have to mobilize big financial resources for a universal basic income, that public services and public investment would dry up tremendously, and the public purse would not have the money anymore, which it needs to provide public services. And I think that would definitely be a step in the wrong direction. So public services are more important than a universal basic income. I would certainly support this claim. But we need to think a little bit about why are we having this discussion, and why is the UBI so popular, and why does it pop up everywhere and people sort of do experiments with it and do campaigns about it. And I think that has something to do with what Esther said about economic insecurity. I think we are living in times where in many European member states, there are pockets in the labor market which are characterized by high levels of economic insecurity. And these levels of economic insecurity are reaching now up to the middle classes. And we have people who previously or traditionally would have classic middle class jobs are now working in employment relationships which are far more insecure than they used to be. And that leads to resistance, and it leads to political pressure of people who want to make the system fairer. And these are people who do not want to claim social assistance, or they do not want to claim unemployment insurance. They want to lead lives in which they can be self-employed and in which they have freelance jobs, but they want to live these freelance jobs in a way that it's less economically insecure. And I think we have to respond to that. So the UBI is one level of responding to that. I don't think it's a good way, or I definitely don't think it's the best way, but we have to find answers to this claim, and we have to find answers to the political pressure that comes out of these people. And if I was to choose, I would make the access to social assistance and unemployment insurance much easier. And that is also something which we have seen in the crisis, that many governments have made the access to social assistance for instance, for the self-employed much easier, that people can claim social assistance if they were previously self-employed and they now have lost their businesses. And I think we should do that, and we should remove the stigma that is attached to claiming money from social assistance. I think it should be much more straightforward and much more attached to a certain negative stigma if you have to claim some kind of social assistance because that your business is not working anymore, or because you're losing your job, or because of something that happens now in very insecure times. I think it should be a right, and it should be a straightforward transaction to claim assistance from the government. And it does not have to be a UBI to do so. The governments could just make it easier and open it up and take the stigma away, and therefore take away a lot of the economic insecurities which are there at the moment.
I don't know, Torsten or Esther, do you want to say something about the services and?
Yeah, so I'd say two things, because it struck me I didn't put a good argument for the European level either, so I just want to do that as well. So but on the services, yeah, the big fear associated with the UBI approach is that it fits well into a privatization argument, which is you give this amount of money to people and then they pay and choose their own services. You know, so it fits well within a vision of society which is about privatization rather than public services. So that is another one of the fears associated with it. But just on the need for an EU level approach to this, I was reading that the Amazon is making a fortune yet again during this crisis, and it just struck me how little they pay their workers, how unsafe the conditions reported are, and part of our discussion, particularly as trade unionists, in the new normal, has to be how do we change that so that the conditions of work are and employers are forced to live up to their responsibilities and pay a better, fairer share towards both people in work and people the rest of society as well. So the only way to stand up to large companies now, small member states can't do it on their own. The only way in which we're going to be able to tackle this big problems that we have with online platforms as well, refusing to recognize that they're employers and live up to their responsibilities, and all these new innovations and ways of undermining well-established systems. I think the best and most effective way of doing that is to have an EU-wide approach. So it doesn't matter where those companies go in Europe, they're faced with a same set of demands to have a fair wage, to recognize the union, to live up to your responsibilities as an employer, to pay your fair way, and not to take all of the benefits of the European single market, and then, you know, just take it all for yourself and not give back either to your workforce or to wider society. That type of practice, which is out there, big and small, we need to have a stronger plan than just one which focuses on, with say, universal basic income or living wage. It also needs to be about putting the power back into the hands of the workforce, building a strong labour approach, which is to tackle it.
Yes, I don't know if Torsten wants to answer, but I also have another one maybe to add. Another question I see here for the European level. How can we achieve a functioning mechanism for collective bargaining of living wages in combination with the equally pressing need for coordination devices in macroeconomic policy at the European level? Are the current multi-level governance structures suitable, sufficient for this to happen? Maybe also an interesting...
Yes, but we haven't answered your question, living wage and unemployed yet, no? Because I think that's a very interesting question, because it relates to the relationship between living wage or minimum wage and minimum income. I mean, a living wage, by definition, applies or refers to a person in work, whereas the minimum income also covers those people not in work. And that's why the question whether the two are compatible, I think, is not the right one. I think, on the contrary, the two mutually complement each other. Because when we talk about a living wage, even the most elaborated mechanism of determining the living wage, like in the UK, where you have 17 different types of households for which you calculate, based on a basket of goods and services, a certain wage that is needed to make a living, and then you build the weight average of these 17 households. Even that means that if you establish a single number of a living wage, that means that for some households, for some workers living in a certain household, the living wage will not be enough. And that is where the state comes in and needs to top up, in a situation like that, the wage earned to make a living. And that is where I think the minimum income scheme comes in, because the minimum income schemes establishes or ensures that there is a social safety net within the state that ensures that every person makes a living. But I think the two are compatible. And in that respect, yes, a living wage, when you talk about this only refers to people in work, but in combination with a minimum income approach, I think it could work to get a broader coverage. And in that respect, I've mentioned the UK, and there we have a national living wage, for instance, but the national living wage is just rebranding the minimum wage that existed. I mean, I heard an interesting quote, it's not enough to call your cat Rover to make it a dog, and that's what happened in the UK. I mean, they just called the minimum wage now national living wage, but there is a real living wage, which is established by the Living Wage Foundation. And I think that's the one based on a basket of goods and services. And that's the one that is the as they call it, the real living wage, which ensures that people can make a living. Yeah. That's it for now.
I'll mute myself. Okay, good. Thank you. I think I don't know if somebody wants to say something, but I would rather round up and finish, because our time is already run out. I would like to thank you very much to the speakers for their thought-provoking contributions, and the audience as well to be with us today. I think that the slides I haven't asked, but I think that we could put them on our website, and the recording of the webinar as well we'll put on our website. So you will receive a link to it tomorrow, the latest. And I hope to be able to welcome you at our next webinars in the New Normal After COVID series, in which we look at how the world of work could and should look like after this unexpected crisis. Please follow our website and social media to learn about our next events and all other resources that the ETUI has developed on the social impact of COVID-19. So that's for me. Goodbye and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.